The way of the world, broad path, easy response, whatever you want to do, man, just go for it. Because anybody can get on that path. You don't have to put a lot of thought into it. Just react. Just live your life in total reaction. And if it crushes people, it crushes people. That's just the way it is. They shouldn't have crossed me. And it's not just reciprocity, but that's part of it. In fact, it's a big part of it, and it's one that I really want to hone in on. It's one that the podcasts, when we've walked through those first few chapters of Genesis, has really got me sort of stirring, and I think that's part of where this message sort of found itself, was in that investigation. But I think that golden rule is the narrow gate because it's opposite of my natural approach. Before I get into that real reciprocity, I want to look one more time at that golden rule and at a phrase that's at the end that is almost always ignored when we quote the golden rule. In fact, if I were to say to you, hey guys, write down the golden rule, almost everyone would write, do unto others you'd have them do unto you, and we put a period right there. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, basically, do unto others you'd have them do unto you, for such is the law and the prophets. Now, why do we drop that last part off? I think because it doesn't fit as well on a plaque in our house, do unto others you'd have them do unto you, for such is the law and the prophets. We go, well, what's that last part? Who cares? It's not as good on a bumper sticker. It doesn't work as well on a t-shirt. But it's also, when we start talking law and prophets, it starts sounding real theological and you kind of lose people. It's like, what? You can do just fine with the golden rule without the law and prophets line, right? You still get the gist. Do unto others you'd have them do unto you. Great, wonderful, stick a period on it. But for purposes of this message, because Jesus doesn't stick a period on it, let's don't. And let's assume that saying, for such is the law and the prophets, actually means something, which, hint, hint, it actually means something, because he wouldn't have said it if it didn't. So when Jesus says, do to other people the way you wish they would do to you, for such is the law and the prophets, he's letting you know what the law and the prophets was trying to get you to do. The law and the prophets was actually, corporately, trying to get you to treat other people the way you wish you could be treated. In other words, it was trying to actually get you to love your neighbor, or it sounds like this in another passage, love your neighbor as yourself, which is the baseline of do unto others the way you'd have them do unto you. So it's Jesus saying, if you really want to know what the law and the prophets were trying to get you to do, and this is where Jesus and Paul come into perfect harmony. Jesus just doesn't lay the theology. Jesus is not in the world to give you deep systematic theology. Jesus is in the world to show you the face of the Father and to introduce you to the kingdom. And that's why you really need to pay attention to Jesus. Paul gives you systematic theology on a lot of topics. That's why you ought to pay attention to Paul, because they're both great to have. You need the day-to-day of the kingdom and what it means to treat your neighbor. But you do need some theology on what does it mean to be righteous, and what is identity all about, and what's it mean that I'm justified, and can I really prove that I'm forgiven of my sins? And you have Jesus stories that help, but you have Pauline theology and Peter theology and Johannine, John theology that really kind of help round out those ideas. So we need those epistles. Man, do we need them. They give us sort of the fullness of that. But where Jesus and Paul marry perfectly, even though they speak it differently, is Paul starts to come up with a theology, particularly in the book of Romans, where he says, listen, everything that was ever written down back here, what we would call the Old Testament, he doesn't say it that way, but we would call it he calls it the Old Covenant. Everything is back there in that Old Covenant. He goes, the mistake that Israel made was thinking that by keeping it, they could be made righteous. And he goes, the blessing that's fallen upon Gentiles is that they didn't ask for it by their works. They asked for righteousness by faith. And so what Paul comes up with is, listen, Jewish brothers, this is how he opens Romans 10. He goes, I could wish to God that I was accursed so that my Jewish brothers be saved. And he goes, it doesn't work that way. He said, but my Jewish brothers who were ignorant of God's righteousness went about to establish their own righteousness. And he goes on to tell us that righteousness can only be found in Jesus. Now, when did they start trying to become righteous on their own? When they started to embrace the law as the equipment that you need to be righteous. And so the law was given, and they took it to mean, if we could do this, we'd be righteous. If we don't do this, we won't be righteous. And yet, Israel's righteousness was actually not based upon her ability to keep the law. Her righteousness was based upon believing Abraham. She was connected to Abraham through circumcision. But as her national identity went along, she began to try to find her righteousness through the works of the law. Listen, you're not made righteous through your works. But if you start trying to find your identity through your righteous works, You will find yourself as spiritually dead as the Israel of Romans 9 was finding herself. Dead and miserable. Because you've replaced what the law and the prophets was actually for and started making it about something else. So you say, well, what was it really for? Do unto others as you'd have them to do unto you, for such is the law and the prophets. What's Jesus saying? What you would find if you went back into these Old Covenant passages and stopped trying to use them to be right and just let them inform you, you would realize that throughout those scriptures, God was keeping you off your neighbor. And not only was He keeping you off your neighbor, don't lie to them, don't murder them, don't cheat with them, don't covet their stuff, He was also commanding you on how to treat them. How to treat the stranger in the land. How to treat the people that come into your midst that aren't native to your land.